The first helicopter came screaming out of the bright afternoon sky like a storm that had lost its way. People froze mid-step, shielding their eyes as dust and paper swirled violently across the cracked pavement. Then a second helicopter followed, louder, heavier, more urgent, its blades cutting through the silence of an ordinary day. And just as the crowd began to panic, a voice roared through a megaphone, sharp and desperate, echoing between the buildings. "Where's the doctor? We need the doctor now." Arif Khan stopped walking. His fingers tightened around the worn envelope in his hand, the one that had ended his career just an hour ago. His name had once carried respect, dignity, and purpose. Now it was just ink on a termination letter. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, then back at the chaos unfolding in front of him, unsure if the world was mocking him or calling him back. If you believe in second chances and the quiet power of kindness, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, Lifeline Tales. Stories like this remind us that even the darkest moments can turn into something extraordinary. Arif had spent the morning in a cold office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disappointment. The hospital administrator hadn't even met his eyes while delivering the verdict. Budget cuts, restructuring, liability concerns, words that sounded official but felt hollow. None of them could erase the years Arif had given to saving lives, nor the sleepless nights, nor the trembling hands he had steadied during emergencies. None of them explained how a man who had dedicated his life to healing could suddenly be deemed unnecessary. The sun was harsh as he walked home, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly behind him. His mind was heavier than his steps. He thought about his daughter, Inaya, waiting at home with her schoolbook spread across the table, probably trying to finish her homework before he arrived. She always asked him about his day, her wide eyes filled with curiosity and pride. He didn't know how he would tell her that her father, the doctor she admired so deeply, no longer had a place in the world he had built. The noise of the helicopters shattered his thoughts. People were running now, some ducking for cover, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. Arif stood still, caught between instinct and exhaustion. Then he heard it again, louder this time, almost pleading, "Where's the doctor?" Something inside him stirred. Two uniformed officers jumped out as the helicopters landed roughly in an open lot nearby. Their boots hit the ground with urgency, and their eyes scanned the crowd frantically. One of them grabbed a man by the shoulder, asking questions, shaking his head in frustration when he got no answer. The other officer turned in Arif's direction, his gaze sharp, searching. Arif hesitated. He was no longer a doctor, at least not officially. The badge that had once hung proudly around his neck was now sitting in a drawer back at the hospital, probably already forgotten. But the training, the instinct, the responsibility, those hadn't disappeared with a piece of paper. Before he could think himself out of it, Arif raised his hand slightly. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice steady but quiet. The officer rushed toward him, relief flooding his face as if he had just found water in a desert. There was no time for questions, no time for verification. Arif was pulled forward, guided quickly toward the helicopter where a young boy lay unconscious on a stretcher, his small chest barely rising. The world seemed to narrow into a single moment. The boy's skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. Medical equipment surrounded him, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The paramedics looked overwhelmed, their movements frantic yet uncertain. Arif's instincts kicked in immediately, overriding his doubt, his fear, his recent loss. He stepped closer, his hands steady now. The noise of the helicopter blades faded into the background as Arif focused entirely on the boy. He assessed the situation quickly, recognizing the signs of a rare but critical condition that required immediate intervention. There was no time to transport him to a hospital. The decision had to be made here, now, in the middle of chaos. For a moment, Arif closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about his job anymore. He wasn't thinking about the letter in his pocket or the uncertainty waiting for him at home. He was thinking about the life in front of him, the fragile thread that could slip away at any second. And then he began. His hands moved with precision, guided by years of experience and a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. The officers and paramedics watched in silence, their earlier panic replaced by cautious hope. Time seemed to stretch, each second carrying the weight of possibility and loss. Arif worked through the pressure, through the noise, through the doubt that tried to creep in. He adjusted equipment, administered treatment, and made decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. His mind was clear, focused, alive in a way it hadn't been all day. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the boy's condition began to stabilize. A breath. Another. Color returning to his cheeks like the first light of dawn after a long night. Relief washed over the small group like a wave, quiet but powerful. The tension that had gripped the air began to loosen, replaced by something softer, something human. Arif stepped back, his hands trembling slightly now that the urgency had passed. He looked at the boy, then at the officers, unsure of what to say or do next. One of the officers approached him, his expression filled with gratitude that words couldn't fully capture. He spoke, but Arif barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, caught between what had just happened and what it meant. Because in that moment, Arif realized something profound. He had never stopped being a doctor. Not when he lost his job. Not when he walked out of the hospital doors. Not even when he doubted himself. The title had been taken from him, but the purpose remained. The helicopters eventually lifted off again, carrying the boy to safety. The crowd began to disperse, the chaos fading into memory. Arif stood alone for a moment, the envelope still in his hand, but it felt lighter now, less defining. He resumed walking home, but his steps were different this time, steadier, more certain. When he reached his small apartment, the door creaked open to reveal Inia sitting at the table, her face lighting up instantly when she saw him. She ran to him without hesitation, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that felt like home. Arif held her tightly. He didn't tell her about the job. Not yet. Instead, he told her about the boy, about the helicopters, about how sometimes life throws you into moments you don't expect, moments that remind you who you really are. Inia listened with wide eyes, her admiration unchanged, her belief in him unwavering. And in that simple, quiet room, Arif felt something shift inside him. The next few days were uncertain, filled with questions about the future, about finances, about what would come next. But there was also a new sense of possibility, a quiet confidence that had been missing before. Then, one morning, there was a knock on the door. Arif opened it to find the same officer standing there, along with a well-dressed man whose presence carried authority. The man introduced himself as a representative of a private medical foundation. He explained that the boy Arif had saved was the son of someone very important, someone who had been searching for the doctor who had stepped in when no one else could. They had found him. Not through records or recommendations, but through the impact he had made in a moment of crisis. The foundation offered Arif a position, one that not only recognized his skill but valued his humanity. It wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to rebuild, to continue doing what he loved, and to provide for his daughter without compromise. Arif stood there, overwhelmed. Not because his life had suddenly become easy, but because he had been reminded of something far more important. Sometimes, the world takes things away from us not to punish us, but to redirect us, to place us exactly where we are needed most. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one choice, one act of courage to change everything. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. Before we reach the end,